So I'm reading this paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation by Nick Bostrom. This was published in Philosophical Quarterly in 2003. You can find the PDF very easily. And so here's the abstract, and then we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion if you'd like. Or I can read the introduction as well. So this paper argues that at least one of the following propositions is true. 1. The human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a quote-unquote post-human stage. We'll talk about what post-human means in a second. 2. Any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof. And 3. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. So that's his argument, that at least one of those three is likely. Or true, I should say. And he's going to try to do this in sort of a mathematical way, right? The way that excludes any uncertainty. So again, 1, human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage. So you can think of that as, we all killed each other off in World War III or something like that. 2, any post-human civilization, so this means a civilization basically that has transcended AGI, and that in essence, we can make machines that are smarter than us, which in my opinion we're actually not too far from. That's a minority opinion, but it's my opinion. So any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history. So that's proposition 2. And we'll get into that. That's probably the trickiest proposition. And his third argument is that we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. And again, I really like this argument. When you hear about simulation theory, it sounds silly. It actually kind of sounds ridiculous, right? We're very trained on the kind of, anthrocentric kind of perspective of God and religion. And that's been the status quo for a long time, maybe 5,000 years. So simulation theory is a new way to grapple with the reality of why are we here? Where do we come from? Some of the oldest questions, most important questions probably. And Bostrom's sort of new take on it, and it's not entirely new, but he's sort of the first to really articulate it. Kind of, to me, actually puts him in a pantheon of philosophers that include Aristotle and people like that, sort of seminal philosophers that changed the course of thought and history. Again, it'll be a long time before Bostrom's maybe recognized as such, but I do think, it's certainly possible that ends up being what happens. So anyway, to continue, the abstract also includes, it follows that the belief that there is a significant chance that we will one day become post-humans who run ancestor simulations is false, unless we are currently living in a simulation. So again, he's just using basic logic to conclude that, deduce that. And he finishes by saying a number of other consequences of this result are also discussed. So the introduction is less than a page, so I'm going to read it real quick, and then we'll sort of open it up for some questions. Introduction. Many works of science fiction, as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists, predict that enormous amounts of computer power will be available in the future. Let us suppose for a moment that these predictions are correct. One thing that later generations might do with their super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears, or of people like their forebears. Because their computers would be so powerful, they could run a great many simulations. Suppose that these simulated people are conscious, as they would be if the simulations were sufficiently fine-grained, and if a certain quite widely accepted position in the philosophy of mind is correct. Then it could be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours do not belong to the original race, but rather to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. It is then possible to argue that, if this were the case, we would be rational to think that we are likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. Therefore, if we don't think that we are currently living in a computer simulation, we are not entitled to believe that we will have descendants who will run lots of simulations on their forebears. That is the basic idea. The rest of this paper will spell it out more carefully. Apart from the interest this thesis may hold For those who are engaged in futuristic speculation, there are also more purely theoretical rewards. The argument provides a stimulus for formulating some methodological and metaphysical questions, and it suggests naturalistic analogies to certain traditional religious conceptions, which some may find amusing or thought-provoking. The structure of the paper is as follows. First, we formulate an assumption that we need to import from the philosophy of mind in order to get an argument started. Second, we consider some empirical reasons for thinking that running vastly many simulations of human minds would be within the capability of a future civilization that has developed many of those technologies and can already be shown to be compatible with known physical laws and engineering constraints. This part is not philosophically necessary, but it provides an incentive for paying attention to the rest. Then, following the core of the argument, which makes use of some probability theory, and a section providing support for a weak indifference principle that the argument employs. Lastly, we will discuss some interpretations of this disjunction mentioned in the abstract that forms the conclusion of the simulation argument. So, the paper's fairly short. It's only 14 pages, and if anybody has any thoughts or questions, I'm going to add a speaker and see if people want to discuss this matter. Are we living in a simulation? Or maybe why wouldn't we be living in a simulation is kind of Bostrom's point. And you can go to simulation-argument.com /simulation.pdf. That's where the PDF is. We got most valuable bird here too.
Hey man.
What's up?
How's it going?
Great, you?
Good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I was wondering, so there's a lot of, I want to say like naive takes on simulation theory, even though I find the fundamental case kind of compelling in that it tends to sort of devolve into pseudo-religious thinking rather quickly. So I'm curious, if you give this argument any sort of credence, what would you believe is the most likely nature of these simulators?
Oh yeah, I mean, hard to predict, right? It's at this point science fiction, but I do think if you think about any, well, I'll say this: it's kind of hard to think about evolution outside of your own arc, right? So like, if you think about Conway's Game of Life or other sort of dynamical systems, simulations, things like that, like it's not clear that we're the only endpoint, right? that life can take place in. It's really not clear at all. Asimov thought about life forms that really didn't have physical substrates, that they were kind of like ether-like substrates. So that's a bit wild, but certainly like more of a distributed life that evolved instead of maybe having kind of like the arc that we have, which is that we gather resources, metabolize those resources, evolve, compete, and ultimately like strain out the best biological substrate. That's sort of one possibility, but there's certainly, others you can imagine. You can think about an analogous exoplanet that has things that look like people. That's usually what people think of, some space alien with green skin or something like that. But, there are other kind of conceptual paradigms for life. Viruses are a great example, right? It's well known that there are more viruses, more species of viruses than there are humans by a long shot. I mean, there are more kinds of viruses, there are more amounts of viruses, there are more, everything is vast, on many, many log orders, more than we are. And viruses are funny because they have a biological substrate. Of course, they're atomic, they're molecular, they're based on nucleic acids. But, there's a debate as to whether they're alive or not. Most biologists would say no. But to me, again, having that information payload and just existing in that pure nucleic acid form is really interesting. It makes you wonder, again, something like coronavirus that has a proofreader enzyme. So it'll actually proofread nucleic acids as it's entered into its polymerase to make sure that they're real nucleic acids, because the coronavirus somehow knows, of course doesn't know because it's not sentient, but it knows through the miracle of evolution that its biggest foe is a fake nucleotide, right? So it's evolved, not in a conscious way, but in the meta-conscious way of evolution, it's evolved a proofreader. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It double checks to make sure that the nucleotide it's adding to its polymer is actually a nucleotide and not some poison. like, for example, some of the drugs we've invented to stop coronavirus. So it's a very cool kind of thing. And again, I'm just trying to get myself out of this sort of anthropic sort of perspective of what life looks like. And so once you do that, I think you can kind of sort of start to think that maybe these simulators may not even sort of be consciously simulating us, right? And that's a very deistic view that, I'm no philosopher, by the way. My philosophical inventory runs out after deism, but it's this sort of view that, quote unquote, God created the universe and just sort of let it spin, right? And that's it. How it reaches its logical conclusion and what seed, if you will, the Big Bang got, and what final outcome is kind of deterministic. That idea is pretty neat. And whether there's an infinite number of seeds, when I say seed, I think like more like a seed hash or something like that, right? That encapsulates all the starting conditions of a dynamical system. And
Are you aware of any large-scale, like, current experiments going on where it's just input some initial conditions and see what happens?
Well, large scale, no, but I would say that if you look at a lot of the classical dynamical systems, there are a lot of them. I mean, the game of life is one of the best one, and Wolfram probably has done more research on this than anyone else. Where if you haven't seen his book, I don't know if anybody's actually read it because it's like 1,000,000 pages. It's called A New Kind of Science, and Wolfram discusses kind of what and how a sort of computer system could be one based on sort of let me just check out some of what I'm talking about here for a second. That a Turing complete machine can be done with a state machine, a simple state machine. So I'm looking up kind of what I'm talking about here, where there's this very cool. If you haven't seen these, they're some of the coolest things. Which are these Turing machines or state machines that are done by Wolfram that are based on
derivative of like graph theory?
They're not. I wouldn't say they're graph theory, but I think that they're so. Okay, so sorry, I was just sort of stumbling my words here. So they're cellular automata. That's the phrase I was looking for. I kept wanting to say Conway. There's a name for them now called cellular automata that's been around for a long time. It just skipped my mind for some reason. So it's a cellular automata, and if you haven't seen this work, it's kind of stunning because you can actually work out the automata for yourself. I was first exposed to this as a young teenager, because you could write programs that do this pretty easily, and they end up looking pretty neat. If you're watching me on YouTube, I'm going to pull up some of the cool cellular automata, and I wrote one for Windows 3.1 a long time ago that was just black and white. And here's one I'm looking at now that's got hundreds or thousands of different nodes. Mine was just like a 20 by 20 grid. But it starts off. Conway started off with a small grid, right? Conway recently passed away. Try to find some cool videos of cellular automata here, but there's usually people explaining them. And if you look at them from a 3D perspective or other ways like that, there could be definitely a lot of cool rules you could build. I just did 2D ones, and as the automata take their action and do their thing, it kind of looks like they're alive. And it even simulates kind of something so complex that you have to think that, geez, this has to be non-deterministic. Like, it really feels and looks like these things have, a mind of their own. And of course, when you go to work tomorrow or wake up tomorrow, you might think the exact same thing. You might think, gee, I can do what I want. I can go to work, or I can not go to work, and then I get fired, and then it might end up in a cardboard box down the street. But it's my choice, right? Like, it's not some rule-based system that I'm just following blindly. I can choose whether or not I'm going to work, and I know what the consequences are. And so when you look at this automata, and this is a simple 2D automata, you think, wow, it's amazing. There's no way this thing could be possibly predicted by a formula, and it is. And sometimes those formulas are just a page or less, a couple of variables, really. And if you've ever played around with fractals, which I did a couple years later with various fractal, just basically fractal programs or writing my own fractals, the Mandelbrot set is another sort of similarly amazingly complex thing that comes from nothing. While I was in prison, I worked on something called the collapse conjecture, which is one of the most famous unsolved mathematical problems, which is simply the 3n plus 1 problem. And in 3n plus 1, we basically ask, is there a guarantee that when you multiply a number by 3 and then add 1 to it, and that if you have an odd number, you do it again ad infinitum, or if you have an even number, you just simply divide by 2 and then go back to the original paradigm, will you always go back to 1? And that's something that it's certainly, if you try this out, let's say you tried with 7, you multiply by 3, you get 21, you add 1 to that, so that's why 3n plus 1, you get 22, well, that's odd. I'm sorry, it's even, so you divide by 2, so now you're at 11, and you continue to do this for some time, you will always go back to 1. And I'd encourage you to try it out. But the question is, how do you prove that? And what's amazing about the Collatz problem is that you can keep trying this, and you won't find any great rhyme or reason that one number will take a long time to cycle back, and then some other numbers will not cycle back immediately. Some will cycle back immediately, some won't cycle back immediately. So that's a pretty interesting problem in dynamical systems. And one of the most famous mathematicians, Ergos, said that basically there's no way to solve the Collatz problem. But of course, it's not been proven undecidable either. Erdos famously said that we need a new kind of math to understand problems like this. And it's no secret, or no accident, I should say, that Wolfram called his book A New Kind of Science. Because I do think dynamical systems are the most interesting thing in mathematics, which is a big statement. But it's also kind of like dovetails with Bostrom's work, I think, in the sense that, what looks completely random to us can look completely normal to a greater intelligence. And I think that it's something to be, if one thing simulation theory brings to one metaphysically is it's a sense of peace, that we're not that significant. It's sort of like a little like an existentialist, futurology existentialist, where, you feel comfortable that, you don't matter that much. And that at the end of the day, like all this anthrocentric kind of, I don't know, like, auto-masturbation about, how important we are and how, significant we are is sort of quickly dispelled if you feel like you're just a variable in a computer program. You start to realize, you start to get a little depressed maybe, but you also start to feel better because you at least have an answer about kind of where we are, where we came from. And I think, again, I can't speculate on who might have started the simulation or why, but at least point out maybe something novel, that the simulation doesn't necessarily have had to had some kind of beginning or some kind of activation energy or some kind of like conscious decision where somebody said, let's try. We look at ourselves and we think, okay, well, it would be cool if I shook up this snow globe. It'd be cool if I ran this Conway Game of Life thing. But it's also completely possible that it was ran sort of accidentally or automatically. And again, Bostrom and his current school, which again I'd love to be a part of if I was smart enough, but this sort of school of futurists that's, I think, really sort of advancing the cutting edge of thinking about how and where we are, I think is really exciting. Archie, do you want to jump in? Archie?
I just wanted to. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to get your thoughts on a couple things. I saw the space and had to hop in. I haven't really thought about the simulation theory in a while, but from what I remember, he basically said that there was three sort of possibilities.
Right.
That human civilizations either go extinct before they develop the technology to create simulated realities, right? Like, think, maybe we just always end up going to nuclear war and never getting to that point. The second option, if I'm remembering correctly, was that if some civilizations do get to that phase, that none of them will bother to run simulations, which I think is quite unlikely, in my opinion. And the third one that he said is that advanced civilizations would have the ability to, create many simulations, and that they'd be very, very realistic, which I think, is not that hard to believe.
Yeah.
Just seeing where we are today and, thinking, many years into the future seems kind of likely. So to me, choice B is a little bit unlikely. So it's probably either A or C. And so, when you start thinking in terms of that, it's an interesting philosophical question to think that, in a way it's kind of depressing if it's A. If we sort of just come up with this very powerful nuclear energy, but never
really, wisen up as a society to know how to use it responsibly, and sort of just, it ends up being the destruction of us ultimately. And choice C is obviously quite intriguing also because that opens up the possibility that we are in fact in a simulation. So that's just my framework for evaluating it, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, so we opened up the call by reading the first page or two of Bostrom's tremendous publication, and you summarized it just right. I think that on the part one, I do think we can easily kind of dismiss that. I mean, it may very well be that our human race doesn't end up getting to posthumanism. I think we're actually partially already there. There's a great paper called "Is the Internet Sentient or is the Internet Conscious?" And I think that sort of talks a little bit outside the box of what consciousness is, as opposed to just do we have an AGI? Which I think the answer is obviously we don't quite yet. But after seeing Dolly and GPT-3, I think that there are not too many people that would say that Dolly is as pretty good as it gets when it comes to making an AGI artist. We obviously have pretty strong AGI chess players and things like that as well. But whether we have a true AGI that's not limited, that's the whole point of the word general, I guess. But switching gears for a second about why would it be impossible for there to be all human races or human-like races that end up devolving into anarchy and annihilating themselves? I really don't think that's possible. In fact, our own experience seems to suggest that no matter what we try, we end up coming out just fine. We've come in the precipice of disaster many times, and have so far, again, there's a survivorship bias there, but so far we've made it. So we have a straight shot to it, right? We're maybe only 15 years away, or 20 years away, according to most theorists, to AGI. So I think it's almost a moot point, right? If we come this close, why should there be anything that stops us from getting that last inch of humanity, right? We've been around 100,000 years. 10 or 20 more years doesn't seem like a far cry. There's a wonderful book that was my favorite book, or maybe my second favorite book in prison after reading 400 books. A book called The Three Body Principle, or The Three Body Problem, excuse me. The Three Body Problem by Shijin Liu. It's a science fiction book. It's a genre I normally detest. I find science fact a little bit superior to science fiction. But Shijin Liu is a real scientist too, which helps a lot. The best science fiction is written by practitioners. And so anyway, Liu, I won't spoil the book for you, but in Liu's book, there's kind of a simulation that takes place. And Liu's book is great not because he's a futurologist, but actually because he's a great writer, which is the way most good books should be determined if whether they're good or not. Liu is a literary master, and this is his opus magnum. And he really is, like I said, I won't go into why the book is so great, but I can't speak highly enough about it. I really felt like I was reading a modern day Shakespeare with the way Liu sort of mastered different amazing literary skills and rhetorical devices. But anyway, in the book, Liu has this sort of simulation that is a little like a video game. And at the end of the simulation, when society inevitably destroys itself, the game in the book sort of gives a like game over screen where it says game over, your society reached AD 200, game over, your society reached AD 1000, and there were these various simulations of life, and they seemed like an awesome video game to play, but of course this is a fictional book, and not the real world, but it seemed like, a really fun kind of first real exploration I've seen of this kind of like try and repeat almost like a video game until you make it to the AGI post-human phase. And I think there's no chance that we don't make it there. I mean, I really think even in the event of kind of like a catastrophe, it doesn't feel like we're going to screw things up that bad, and that AGI with things like Google and different TPUs and new technologies like quantum computing, unless these quantum computers sort of destroy humanity somehow, I think we're gonna get there. There's still a lot to be done. We simulate matter a lot. I do it a lot in different chemical and physical sort of computer constructs. They're not perfectly simulating of reality, but they're pretty close. But they don't run for more than a millisecond or something like that, because it takes an enormous amount of computing power to actually simulate reality, and it would take quite a lot more to simulate real reality. Now, having said that, simulations can work with sort of abstractions, right? So you can abstract a lot of physical reality, and we do that when we play video game. We use a program called like Unity, right? When you play Fortnite, you kind of feel like you're moving around in this character's body. You feel like you're jumping up and down, things like that. And a higher quality video game will feel even more like that. But games like Unity have realistic physics, but they abstract the actual physics, right? I mean, that's still computer program, not actual physics. So I think that we can get somewhere, even though we don't have great simulations of actual molecular interactions, we can still get there by abstracting most of the problems away. So
Yeah, and I've heard the argument that while it would take an enormous amount of computer power to generate a simulation that's that realistic, that a counter argument to that potentially could be that we don't necessarily need to have that much power, right? Like we can only sort of simulate what people are looking at various times, and similar to like what you were saying in a video game where let's say the levels that aren't being played at that moment aren't visible to the
sure,
people playing the game. It could be a similar sort of concept in a simulation.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Bostrom is talks about all of this and actually puts some math behind it, which is pretty cool. So again, I think that if you actually line up religion side by side with simulation theory and you ask which one is more coherent and more kind of believable, I don't think there's any contest, to be frank. But religion isn't necessarily something that people want logic out of, right? There's a desire, seems to be human desire for mysticism. Um, that the mysterious and the profound are something we sometimes like. I hate to say this, but we like conspiracy theories for that reason sometimes. Some people are naturally attracted to conspiracy theories because it sort of innervates them in a way that reality doesn't, right? It's pretty boring to learn about something like 5G or like mRNA vaccines or something like that. It's kind of or the physics of, unfortunately, two buildings in New York collapsing. It's more exciting to sort of believe in something magical or something crazy is happening, right? And I think that that kind of thinking is going to stay with us forever. Some of us will fight it, but a lot of us are kind of naturally given to it. I think you kind of can't fight what's inside of you to some extent. But anyway,
It's a simple way to explain some very not simple concepts that people struggle to understand, and it's a way to make sense of it all, I think.
absolutely.
Beyond that, don't you see religion as having sort of role as social software that simulation theory, as currently stated, just can't fill?
Yeah.
So simulation theory doesn't say anything about how, and I'm not religious, by the way, this is just an empirical observation.
You're right.
Simulation theory doesn't say how to live your life, how to treat other people, how to organize a society.
Yeah, and I think it's because there's no answer for that, right? And that we can actually do that without religion, right? I think that we can do that with law, right? We can do that with normative.
Is that scalable though? Like you as an individual, I forget, one of these like public intellectuals said that atheism isn't scalable, and that always kind of resonated with me. That individual atheists can lead very fulfilling, meaningful lives, but whether that can be done at scale is something that...
It's a good question. I think that if you look at the latest statistics as to whether or not Americans have attended a religious ceremony in the last 30 days, I think that number is down to the lowest it's ever has been, and it's around 50%. So arguably, it's already at scale. Most of China, most of Japan is atheist. So you've got a big swath of the world that's pretty a-religious. There are, in fact, very few places in the world that are deeply, deeply religious and not secular anyway. So I think that religion is dying a death regardless. And it's being... Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, please, go ahead. No, I think the question is, what you're asking is where's that utility going to come from? Are we going to be left in a dearth without, some kind of guidepost? And I think that I'm not sure religion is scalable in and of itself anyway, because at the end of the day, like, getting your pecking order from a book or from a weekly, kind of visit with a religious leader. Again, nothing wrong with that, by the way. I'm not anti-religion. I'm just sort of trying to understand kind of what benefits we get necessarily that we don't get out of the law, right? The law sort of enforces you to do something, whereas maybe religion guides you not to do it in the first place, right? Law sort of enforces the punishment. Religion hopes that you don't even worry about it and don't do it in the first place, which I do think that.
That's exactly it. I think it comes down to just do you believe that humans can be moral without religion, right? Like, do you think that they can intrinsically just come to sort of a agreement of what's moral, and let's say it's just don't treat someone else the way that you wouldn't want to be treated, right? And something as simple as that, or do you believe that without religion, humans are just going to do whatever's in their best interest and sort of not be moral, right? So I think it sort of just comes down to how you think about humans in that regard.
Yeah, and if Christopher Hitchens were here, he'd probably tell you that religion's been the least moral, least kind of driver of morality and driver of peace ever, right? More people have been slaughtered in the name of God than anywhere else. So I think the law is a little more scalable than religious edict, but again, edict only works so insofar as that people listen to it. So I think that we're in a point in civilization where we are a little lost as to what the goal is.
Laws only function if there's a shared, let's call it security substrate, though, right? So there's no way laws could manufacture a solution between what's happening in Ukraine right now, right? So I'm saying at a global scale, if we are trying to move into this global sort of post-humanistic
Yeah.
society, how do you kind of ad hoc merge all these different set of laws?
Or norms, right? I think that we're struggling with that right now. I mean, if you look at whether it's war or the horrible trend of school shootings, or what we're doing with social media, there's a lot of questions as to what is normative behavior, what do we want out of society, what do we want out of civilization, what makes sense, and I think that there are people that are really lost on that. I don't know what the answer is, of course, and I don't know that simulation theory provides it. But I do think, getting back to existentialism for a second, that there is this freeing, there is a freeing nature that comes with the realization, if you will, I'm saying this sort of prospectively or hypothetically, that comes with the hypothetical realization that life is absurd, right? For some people, that's crazy enough that they'll commit suicide, or crazy enough that they'll kind of abandon all their life goals, which isn't a good thing necessarily. But again, life is absurd, right? We're a bunch of hydrocarbons. We end up being a bunch of hydrocarbons in hundreds of years after we die, and we'll stay hydrocarbons pretty much forever. Fossil fuels, right? And so, the idea that we're somewhat sentient and organized in this way, and that's interesting, and then we'll be dead, and then that sort of spark within us will be gone, but we'll still mostly be this sort of biological set of hydrocarbons. I don't know. It's some people can find that really miserable and really kind of depressing. But some
peaceful in a way.
Yeah, some people would find it peaceful. And again, to the extent that it sort of was originated out of a simulation, when you program and you press compile and run the program, in some ways you're creating this little tiny simulation. Now it's nothing enough to simulate sentience, but it can simulate something, and you're giving rise to this little universe. So maybe there's somebody programming us and pressing compile, and do you regret being a variable in that program? You are what you are, right? You maybe wish you were the programmer, maybe you wish you were something else, but ultimately you are that programmer, and to the extent the bug may not feel too does the bug in that you step on necessarily feel any emotion about being stepped on or being a bug in the first place? I think that there's this freedom of kind of insignificance, and I think that's what existentialism brought to the table, but it didn't bring the context as to why, right? I think people like Camus and Sartre and Nietzsche and others all sort of said, well, this is ridiculous, we don't exist in any meaningful way, we kind of are just bugs wandering around the universe, and our time is short and our time is coming. And it's pretty depressing. But then when you put it into the context of Bostrom and simulation theory, and you sort of say, well, you were programmed. You were just sort of the output of some input and some function, and that's it. There is this piece of sort of saying, okay, well, maybe there's not a reason why we're here, but I can at least sort of trace back a causality and say that, I exist because of this. In most, at least with some amount of likelihood, as opposed to kind of swallowing the absurdity of a belief of, well, I exist because, and again, I'm sorry if I offend somebody here, but I exist because of this origin story that is almost certainly contrived. Um, that it's somewhat more likely that we're sort of a program simulation. Again, the problem with this to me, which I don't think anybody really talks about, is that we're dealing with semantics, because it's we think of a simulation, we think of again an instruction set, a compiler, some kind of programming language, but the programming language of quote unquote God is a little bit hard to understand, especially as us sort of tiny brained people. I think it'd be really hard to sort of say, well, God's running this kind of function, or God's making an array of this or that. And maybe the fields that we see in physics are the arrays, um, but ultimately, like, it's really hard to sort of penetrate that mind and understand kind of what the heck is actually sort of going on. We got to find a fellow EACCer in here, so I've been trying to blow the ACC horn, and finally somebody's heard it. So